The Brew, the final season of The Brew, and I am Dr. Drew Karanen. I kicked out Dr. G just for a bit. If you haven't been around, this is our time to talk, just us. Later on, you're going to get a chance to ask him whatever it is that you've always wanted to ask him, but we're afraid to. And we're also going to talk about his new book, Magick at the Crossroads, Italian Folk Magic, an Old Religion. And we're going to talk about the many ways that our paths have crossed religiously and spiritually. And we might even put him on the hot seat. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Stay tuned.
I'm back.
You're back. You're back. Would you introduce yourself for the listening audience?
Yep, I am. For those who don't know me, I am Gianmichael Salvato, also known as Daddy Warlock, and probably a few other things that we don't want to say on here if we want to keep this open for kids.
Oh, so I can't swear?
Oh yeah, you can swear.
Okay, thank God.
They have to be mature kids.
Okay, yeah, we should do like Marie Forleo does when she has a racy one. Just there's a language issue, and so if that offends you, probably don't watch this episode, or put your your earphones on if the kids are around. So thank you so much for taking me up on my offer to interview you. I'm loving the book. I love you, you know that. And I just am really excited about diving right in and talking about this new book that you have. First question out the door here. What convinced you that this needed to be written?
Well, it's thanks again for offering to do this too, because there is we could probably talk about it a little bit later. There's kind of a culture in which controversial books don't get talked about on YouTube in pagan spaces because it tends to make publishers nervous that their authors are communicating with the fringes. It kind of makes blog platforms nervous that some of their authors may be questioning the status quo. And that's really kind of why I wanted to do the book. In our tradition, in my tradition, the Italian folk magic tradition, or Stregheria, we are encouraged. I would say that we're prohibited, but it's not really that strict of a rule. But we're encouraged not to teach publicly until we're 50 years old or older. And so this book has been sitting in my gut for probably 10 years now, and I was waiting for to honor the tradition. I was working out some of the stuff I talk about in the book about where do I fit in terms of the old religion, where do I fit in terms of the craft itself. And is there intersectionality there? That was a big question for me that was still kind of unanswered until 4 or 5 years ago. And I think when I started to answer that, that's when, as we know, when we're willing to look at the question, then that opens the door to all of the other questions that come as supporting material, encouragement, answers, deeper questions. And as I started to write the book, it kind of became an adventure all in and of itself, with new people coming into my life and saying, I've been looking for this. And so we put it down on paper, and I'm pretty proud of it. It's kind of, I always thought that my biography would be the most gut-wrenching thing that I had to put on paper. And this was definitely much more so.
Well, at least you planned it that way. When I wrote my last book, it was all supposed to be all about my grandma Esther, and I realized by the time I got done with it, I had written my first autobiography because so much had to be explained. And you do such a wonderful job of explaining where you come from and you pull all of these different things together. You talk a little bit about the fringe. In your medical practice, I don't know if you still use the term alternative medicine. I do not, because I think of alternative medicine as the people in the white coats that go into hospitals and doctor's office, and in other words, modern medicine. That's the alternative. I like working from a spiritual standpoint with the medical profession, and that some of the things that you and I both do, and calling them complementary. One isn't replacing the other, it's working together. And this is what you've done. You have blended so many fringe communities, if you will, and mainstream communities within yourself. There's so much about you that I still don't know, and I'm looking forward to finding out more about. The first quote I wanted to give you from the book was this. You said, "Someone suggested that it's possible that my apparent decision to stay out of the witch wars was likely because I was dealing with my own internal witch wars, which directly led to the development of the material for this book, and I'm inclined to agree." So, because my own spiritual path and my religious background has been almost as eclectic and as numerous as yours, I do find myself dealing with some internal issues. It's clarifying, but it's also as annoying as shit sometimes. So if it's not too personal, could you give us at least one example of your own internal witch wars?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the question that's at the heart of everything in the book is, I like you, I came from a very well blended, I'll say, spiritual tradition that I didn't set out to be eclectic. I have friends who say, oh, I just draw from here and here and here and here, and that's very intentional, and I think that's beautiful. I didn't set out to do that, but at a very early age, I knew that I was a weird kid. So I was a child on the fringes, and for whatever reason, I can't say that there was like some great wisdom that made me come to this point, but I was just okay with that. Like I was good with being on the fringes because I knew the one place I didn't want to be was not on the fringes, because I looked at that and said, oh, that's just not me. And so I kind of carved my niche out, and I didn't necessarily consciously draw those people from those different traditions like Swami Abhishektananda, Swami Dayananda into my life as a kid. But now as an adult, I recognize that I was doing that from the get-go by just being
Right.
open to it and
Yeah.
hungry and reaching for it. And we reach and our hands get filled.
I
So
I was always the weird kid as well, but I didn't take such a calm approach to it. I tried to fit in, and I thought I wasn't fitting in because I was a witness and one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I thought it was because I was gay, or I thought it was because we lived in a trailer park, or I thought all those other things. And I just finally, when I got to it much later in life than you did, with really accepting my own weirdness and my own differences, and being on the fringe, which is fine.
yeah, I had my grandmother told me, I think I was 6 or 7 years old, and she explained to me the old English word weird and what it meant. And from that point on, that was my badge of honor. And so the struggles to your question, the internal witch wars for me were that I understood early on, and kind of organically, it wasn't that anybody drew a line in the sand, but I understood the difference between the old religion and how the old religion had also kind of merged into the Italian version, we'll say, of Santeria, which is called Benedicaria, or in the 20th century, Raven Grimasi's Stregheria, which was kind of a cloaking the old religion practices under the guise of Catholicism. And separate from that was the work that we do, the spiritual work, the craft work, the magic and witchcraft, if you will. And so at every stage in my journey, when I went into the Buddhist monastery, there was their tradition of esoteric practices that I was naturally drawn to. And I tried to incorporate these things because to me, truth was truth. But then as I became, and that was when I was 16, when I became an adult, it became evident to me that one, I was never going to be a good employee for anyone. I did not have the stuff of being an employee. So I knew I had to monetize my practice myself. And I became very quickly aware that when the those, what do they call it, like the youthful possibility that I was thinking that, oh yeah, so this is going to be a piece of cake, because I don't know anybody else doing what I'm doing. I quickly learned that those rose-colored glasses weren't taking into account other people's fear space. And so if I was going to monetize my practice, it would be easier for me to do so in a as a spiritual, doing as a practitioner, or later as a naturopathic physician. Although I understood that as a naturopath, I was really practicing the craft that my grandmother and great grandmother and everyone else did. The only
Right.
difference was I understood a little more of the science behind it, and I could use sciencey, medically words for it. So that struggle was always between doing what it takes to be able to keep a roof over my head and authentically being myself. And
I
it
love
reached kind of a crescendo later in life.
right. I do love the graph that you drew of how we have witchcraft on one side of the craft, and then you have the religious part and the intersection of these. Um, I think it was actually very freeing for me, and I want to thank you personally for that, because while I have practiced witchcraft and spell crafting and various types of magic for years, for the last 4 decades, really. Um, I've never felt really in tune with Wicca as my religious path. I used to say that religious science and the science of mind, New Thought philosophy, was my philosophy and my way of life, and my religion was Wicca. And I don't say that anymore, because I don't have that religious connection with what I do. I think, yeah, you've heard my definition of what magic is. It's the use of natural but little understood laws to affect change. And as you and I have discussed, that's also the definition for spiritual mind treatment and New Thought, or science of mind philosophy. So I believe in magic in that same way. What you said, though, in the book was that I believe that this is where people who try to turn witchcraft into a religion have lost their way. So talk a little bit more about the religious aspects of witchcraft, or whether it is or whether it isn't, and this press to make it into a religion. I know that there are people out there in our community, meaning the pagan community, that disagree vehemently with both of us. And those are the ones who are very strict on, this is what our coven says, this is what our books say, this is the way it is. I find that convenient, as I found the Bible convenient, because it gives me laws instead of principles. So talk to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think probably in order to be able to communicate that effectively, and that's probably the one message that I wish I could get across to so many of the people that make up our tribe, who may um, feel like they have to hold me at arm's length because their publishers might get angry, their blog directors might get angry, because I think they're misunderstanding the point. As an anthropologist, I look at the history of the magical traditions in a general broad stroke. And what we had in the we'll talk about what I know the best, in the Tuscan region in Italy, was Leland, when Leland went to Charles Leland went to Italy. He encountered these people who were involved in the practices of Stregheria, of witchcraft, or Italian folk magic, and they invited him to come and be part of the boschetto, or the grove, the coven. Well, I think that as an outsider, if I were to see a coven for the first time, and I would see the workings that take place in a coven, I might assume that that was about witchcraft. And I think that where our language fails us, is that we've come to think of witchcraft as a form of magic, and that the witchcraft is so our form of magic is witchcraft, and therefore if there are witches that are involved in the coven, their form of magic is witchcraft. And I don't think that that's so. I liken it to going into an Episcopalian or Catholic church, and while the ceremonies might be officiated mostly by priests or bishops within that particular religious sect, not everybody who's in the church who attends a mass is a priest or a bishop. And so just as in a coven, you might see people who may or may not have been witches, as serving as the high priest or the high priestess or the guardian, for that boschetto. Not everybody there was a witch. There were bakers and bookkeepers and tailors and hairdressers that were all there. But I think where the witch wars, a lot of the witch wars come from, is not being at that place where, as you just so eloquently put it, we recognize what magic really is. And so magic doesn't just belong to witches. Magic doesn't just belong to shaman. Magic doesn't just belong to practitioners of the old religions. But the old religions were about worshiping the god and goddess in that particular form. And so I think that where the problem, the big struggle that's taking place, and I also think out of that struggle, a phoenix is arising from in the form of the younger practitioners who are saying, yeah, magic as a ritual practice, as a community building practice is nice, but it's not necessarily where I think the deeper a practitioner goes. They reach a point where they understand, and they don't necessarily have to follow, but understand why solitary practitioners exist.
Yeah.
And they exist because magic is part of our DNA, and it has to express itself. It's the one, or the universal, or the guiding principle, expressing itself individually and diversely. And we can't do that when we're part of a collective. No. As well as we can when we say, okay, the collective is nice, that's my community, I can hang out with them on Friday nights or whatever. And for me, it just reached a point where I couldn't do that anymore because of the notions of things like high magic versus low magic. That's like saying that a person on the autistic spectrum is high functioning versus low functioning, and it just doesn't work for me. Labels are just so not a part of where I am today.
Well, it also makes a hierarchy, because we find people, and the witches and in the world will sometimes, our way is the way, and that sounds a lot like fundamentalist, whether it's Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or whatever, that our way has to be the way, instead of seeing this multifaceted divine intelligence that embraces everything. Something that you mentioned about researching the powwow that we have here in southeastern Pennsylvania, that came over from the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Germans that came over at that time. It was interesting. You talked to some of them and they said, oh, well, we're not practicing magic. We're just doing herbs. We're doing things like this. It wasn't until last summer when I attended Hex Fest down in New Orleans, which is a total hoot to go to. But I attended a class called The Cunning Man, and I had never heard that term before. So during the medieval times, when witches or perceived witches, females, were being burned at the stake, male witches, being called cunning men, were very happily practicing witchcraft in their cottages, but not calling it that. And that's what I've had to deal with in my eclectic spirituality. Is I've had people in one organization or the other not want to hear about that. Oh, it's fine that you do that, but I don't want to hear about it. We can't talk about that. And because that's not the way we do it. And so you aren't looked at as being really true to the teaching if you have something else.
Yeah, and isn't it odd, because the something else that we have is at the core of what those other religious institutions or philosophies, or whatever we want to call them, it's what they do and what they practice, and what we do and practice is no different. I was at a
So,
metaphysical chapel somewhere here in South Central Pennsylvania, um, not long ago. I guess about 8 years ago, they asked me to come and speak, and I was happy to do so. And right before I went out to speak, I was told by the pastor, or whatever her position was, just as long as you don't talk about anything political and don't talk about witchcraft per se, you can talk about anything else that you want.
I
Well,
bet that was a quiet talk.
yeah, so there was a talk that I was writing as I was walking up to the podium, and I was, I was offended because uh, for me, my craft is nothing. My spiritual practice is nothing if it's not political. If I'm not willing to stand up for social justice issues, if I'm not willing to be the hand up to the person who's in need, then my spiritual practice is hollow and has absolutely no validity. It's dress up, and that's what I experienced in that particular organization. Was there were lots of people who had crystals in their pockets, and mala beads around their neck, and whatever, but they had to play according to the rules of excuse me, of social etiquette.
Mhm.
And being on a neurotypical person, I don't play by those rules. I've never played by those rules, and so I think that uh, I'm not absolutely certain. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, but I wanted to get a sense of feedback from folks, because my sense is that we're reaching that point where more and more people are, whether you want to call it ascending or accelerating vibrationally, or maturing spiritually, they're reaching a point where they're saying, yeah, the ritual and the dogma and the my way is best is nice for those who want it, but it's not what I'm all about. And
Yeah,
I
it's
want to
very.
lock arms with people who are my tribe.
I don't criticize them, but it's as you said, it's not my way either. It's very comforting. In fact, at one point I thought of going into monastery, and I realized that my reasons for going in were not pure. I wanted to go in to eliminate all the problems that I was having in the world and in my life. And I thought that would do that. And fortunately, I discovered that, before I made that decision. But I've had that same experience as you have in New Thought churches, where we can talk about American, Indian, indigenous people in this part of in North America doing their ceremonies. We can talk about Jewish ceremonies. We can do Kwanzaa ceremonies. We do all these things, but as soon as you bring witchcraft in there, that's you can't do that. And yet we have all sorts of ministers that have various backgrounds, Sufi backgrounds, Jewish, all sorts of backgrounds, and combining that. But there's that stigma with bringing up magic or witchcraft, which actually brings me to Gianluca's journal. And in the middle of the book, you give us a look inside at one of your ancestors, particularly after the destruction that Mount Vesuvius caused in that area. As I was reading that, I thought, having a history like this, which I do not, um, it can provide one with a sense of purpose to give meaning and direction to life. So my question is this the case for you? And the follow-up to that is, where can witches like me, who have little or nothing passed down from our families, get that kind of guidance and direction?
That's wow. That's a big one. I
That's
think
why you asked me.
I think that yes, absolutely, without question, it's been a major influence for me. It's been kind of that seed that grew and became my purpose. And recognizing that that words fail us here too, because my purpose is always evolving, and that seed grows into a tree. And it may be that I linger for a while on this branch, but as the tree grows, I realize that I'm being more drawn into a different branch. But the basis of it is still that foundational tree. And so I think for people who don't have that background, because understand that as I say in the book, I take those oral tradition stories with a grain of salt. I don't know how clever or how imaginative some of my ancestors may have been at any point in time. We all like to think that they, would be, brilliant bards, and that's all romantic. But there's, like one example I think I give in the book is that I'm supposedly the 108th throne holder to the high
Right.
priest. Well, that would mean that we kept better records than the Chinese. And I somehow doubt that with what was going on in the world, that people were being that meticulous about records. So I understand that it's oral tradition. And so for that reason, I think that that those who aren't sure of their spiritual heritages can just do the same thing that Christians do, that Jews do, that Muslims and Hindus do, and take that sacred mythos that comes from my family and say, if that was happening to his family, that was happening in some aspect, in some form, in mine. We can look at, I do an exercise with students when they say, hey, how do I get in touch with what it was like to be my ancestors, whether they come from a hereditary tradition or not, because the idea, the concept, and this arrogance about, oh well, I'm a hereditary witch, so that somehow what makes me better or more adept than anyone else. If magic is what it is, then it courses in all of our blood, and there might be some who are born aware of that gift, but it doesn't mean they have more of that gift, and it doesn't mean they have greater access to that gift than anyone else. The potentiality still exists there. So I would say, let's look at your Irish. Let's look at some of the Celtic history,
Yeah.
and allow yourself to kind of get immersed in that. Watch movies, fantasy movies about it. Watch Lord of the Rings. Watch whatever it is that allows you to create your origin story mythos. Because at the end of the day, since neither of us were there at the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, um, that story is just as much midrashic tale as the story of Moses wandering in the desert.
Exactly. And you actually said something just a few seconds ago that I written down from your book. You say, I believe a witch is born a witch, but you also say that doesn't mean they can't become it. And it reminded me, my husband Paul and I just went to New York last week rather, and saw the Harry Potter and the Cursed Child parts 1 and 2. And that takes place 20 years after the books end. And Hermione Granger is now the Minister of Magic. And if people know from the books, she was a muggle. She was not a witch person. She did not come from a pure blood family. And yet here she is at the highest, basically the highest level within that storyline. And we can become that. I mean, it took me a long time to use that term, as a witch, but I realized it works. It works for me anyway. There were, my family called them gifts. Oh, she had gifts, or one particular, my great uncle used his gifts. He misused his gifts, is what the family says. Nearly killed my mother because my grandmother would not submit to his advances. But I've seen that gift passed down and it's going on. It's continuing on. My sister has those same gifts. My mother has the gifts that she won't really admit to, but she has very healing hands, to the point of like, take your hand off me, you're burning me. And my godchild, my oldest niece, also has the same gifts of being able to understand and heal and know things that she doesn't know, things that she shouldn't know, is people would say, how do you know that? And that's
There's I was going to say we had a conversation, a few of us online, not long ago, in the past week or two, about you can tell where a person's coming from in terms of their practice and in terms of the craft by whether the movie that now this probably only relates to people our age to maybe in their late 30s, um, but whether the movie that kind of did it for you was The Craft, and I added, or possibly The Covenant, if you were extremely aware of your homosexuality, and or whether the movie that really did it for you was like Practical Magic, or Never Ending Story. And I think that the difference is there, if you're drawn to the craft, that's somebody who recognizes the magic within them, but wants to be guided and formed and molded, and wants that structure, and wants those are going to be the people that are practicing Wicca today, or practicing one of the offshoots of Wicca, or maybe if they were a little bit of a free thinker, they may have started in Wicca and become radical fairies. But the others are the ones that are drawn to the folk magic traditions, and
Right.
who where we just don't have names for that stuff. I mean, in Italy, we use the word Stregheria to refer to witchcraft itself, or the practice of the ancient unknown path itself, but we don't necessarily even have a name for, like, I was never told, so this practice is called Stregheria. It was just what we do. It
Right.
was just like the hoodoo practitioners, and in the South, it was the cunning men and the cunning women who do that thing. So for me, I think it's exciting. In the 21st century, we have Sabrina, the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, where kids are exposed to the cunning woman. They're exposed to people whose gifts might be more psychic. They're exposed to people who are witches. Unfortunately, the mythos of the satanic connection to the witches is
Right.
high camp, and a topic for another day. But they see that there's all of these different ways of expressing magic, and I'm hopeful that that makes somebody say, hey, look at Sabrina's boyfriend, and maybe even though he was part of a witch hunter family, it might be that there's some magic in the bones there,
Mhm.
that's guiding them as well. And so we find that diversity again is the natural, the organic way to live our lives.
My friends and my partners will often, I'll say something or do something or suggest something, and they'll look at me like, how do you know that? And I realized that it was just something our family did. It's something our family worked with. My great aunt lived on a farm, and within the picket fence area around their house, animals of prey would come and live together peacefully. They came there so Aunt Zoa could heal them. It was a broken wing, or it was a thorn in the paw, or something, and there was never anything that went on within that space. It was all very, very calm and very, very peaceful. And isn't that what really is? It's what I read a column in Science of Mind magazine called Practical Prosperity, and this is really what practical magic is. It's not about something special or something we do only on Sabbath or on Esbats, something that we only do when someone asks us to or when the mood is in the right place. It's the way we live our lives. It's incorporating magic and incorporating that spirit of oneness throughout our daily life, regardless of whether it's Sunday or Sabbath or whatever it is.
And that's the key. It's about incorporating that oneness. I think that if there was one message in the book that I hoped to accomplish, even though it seemed like the initial reaction to the book was lines being drawn in the sand, it was to say, I had something this past weekend that really touched me. Among this group of authors and friends that I have who I recognize are between a rock and a hard place. I know that they love me. I know that we have this bond, but I also know that there's certain things they can't do. They can't talk about me or promote what I'm doing the way that I can promote what they're doing. And so I reached out to a couple of those friends and said, look, this is what I'm getting ready to do. I feel like going forward from here, I want to teach everything my grandmother and aunts and the family taught me about the craft side of things, about practical magic, folk magic, and I want to honor the secrecy, the mystery tradition, and recognize that there's a time and a place for initiations and initiatory magic, but that's not my path now, and that what I want to do is I want to make the Italian folk magic tradition available to my tribe. And I don't care if they're Italian or not. And the sort of the confirmation that came from that, this one One person who I, very, very highly regard, who's a leader in the radical fairy movement, um, said, yeah, that's, you've just got to go ahead and write it all down and tweak some of the words if you're kind of overstepping that secrecy thing. Just tweak the words that are being said, make them your own, and then you're just sharing magic, period. So it doesn't have to have a label on it.
Correct.
And the confirmation came that night when if somebody looks at my YouTube channel now, you could see the views that are taking place on most of the videos, and it's a new channel, and it's kind of sparse. There's maybe only 100 videos in there, but that night, the views on the video I did about Stregheria and Stregheria went through the roof, and there's like a tenfold difference.
That's time.
So it's time, and people are ready, and people are hungry for it.
Well, what you said your intent was for the book, it did for me. I can only speak for myself, but your book not only educated me on things in Italian folk magic and your history personally that I would have never guessed or known, but it also clarified that I'm not nearly as weird as I thought I was, that there's at least one other person out there who has an eclectic spirituality. And I found it comforting and educational and also quite quite humorous. Your mention of finding the right practitioner being like a witch's version of Angie's List, I just laughed out loud. Which I was sitting in Faulkner Hyundai getting my car work done this morning, and people were just looking at me, which happens a lot, as you can imagine, but that's okay. I just thought it was hysterical. I mean, your humor, your down to earth, the way you present is just beautiful. We've gone well over our half hour. I've hijacked your show. I don't want to take too much advantage of it, but has anyone that's watching send you any questions that are in there that you'd like to respond to?
No, we actually just, Deborah Neary just said, good to be here with you, my dear friend up in Saratoga Springs. So hello, Deborah, and we're glad you're here as well. We generally get the majority of, I'm finding that there is definitely a summer rhythm to these shows. And in the summertime, the views come later at night and the next day. So just for those that are watching, we would both be happy to answer any questions you have. Just go ahead and put them in the comments below. As always, we appreciate those who like, share, and if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, or if you're listening to the podcast, do whatever the podcast version of that is of like, share, and subscribe. And Terry, I can't thank you enough for giving me this opportunity, because it wasn't, I sensed that it wasn't going to come any other way than what we did here. And you are more than welcome to jump on the show. I know that you've got a full plate, but anytime you want to co-host with me, the door is open. And I just want to put that out there officially on our season finale. This is it. This is the end of season 3. So we will also be taking some time off, as many of you know. Next Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I am getting married. So we will. So next Wednesday, I intend to be just as distracted. Although I think I might have scheduled a show next Wednesday, but I will. Whether I do or don't, I'm really not sure now that I just said that. I think that the next show that I have scheduled is in September. But the new season officially starts in September, and will be the week September 11th. We're going to do a very quiet show, kind of contemplative show, just in honor of those that we've lost and that I've personally lost on that horrible day. But the following week we will be back with our normal shenanigans and irreverence and everything else. Terry, thanks so much for being here. And anything else you want to add before we take it away?
No, I just everyone have a great rest of the summer, and we'll see you back next season. I'd love to be on again.
Sounds great. Let me see. doing this all at once is just really okay, guys. Thanks so much. It's really been odd being in the. It's so calming and relaxing. You did such a fantastic job. I didn't even have a moment to stop to think of. I didn't even look at the time. And we have gone over. So, guys who are watching, thank you for spending this time with us. Terry, I love you. Thank you so much.
Love you too, brother.
And viewers, love you guys as well. And we'll see you next time, possibly next week, if knowing me.